Sanhedrin Perches Amud Beis, Fundamentalism, the Root of Dissension, Rabu Maxloket Israel. I'm speaking to you from Greenville, North Carolina, where I'm working with a client, and want to share with you the essence of the Matmonim shir that I gave on Shabbos in Silver Spring, Maryland, on this particular sugya on Daf Perches, where we have described for us the mechanism, the judicial bureaucracy almost, that ensured the integrity of Psak Halacha. Psak Halacha is the halachic decisions that are made based on the principles that were handed down from Moshe at Sinai and through the generations. And of course, as the generations develop, and as the Rambam explains, we get further and further away from source, there is the possibility of difference of opinions. Now, difference of opinions is not something that we're afraid of. It's something that we embrace. But when those difference of opinions lead to differences in practice that can, in fact, create what Chazal call Shtei Torot, almost two Torahs, two different religions within Klal Yisrael, there we have a problem. And here we have described the mechanism to prevent that from happening. The mechanism was a system of courts of law populated by the most amazing scholars and intellectual giants in Torah of that particular time. Each town had a Beis Din of 23 such scholars, of 23 Dayanim, judges. And if an individual in that town, one Rav, one Talmud Chacham in the town, had a view which was not aligned with the majority view of that Beit Din, he would go and discuss it with them. If they had a Kabbalah, if they had a Masorah, if they had learned from previous generations what the answer is to this person's dilemma, they would say so. And if not, they would say, Lo Shamanu, we haven't heard, we don't have a Kabbalah, we don't have a tradition in this particular issue. Let's go to another Beis Din and see, maybe they do, and they would go to a neighboring town. If the neighboring town's Beit Din also hadn't heard, they would say, Lo Shamanu, we don't have a tradition on this, and they would then go to Yerushalayim. There were a series of different levels of Batei Din, one that sat outside at the entrance of the Beit HaMikdash, one that sat in the center of the Beit HaMikdash, and one that sat in the Azara itself, which was the Sanhedrin, which is the ultimate authority. And the issue would be raised from level to level until it got to the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin would either say, Shamanu, we have a tradition on this, and this is what the tradition is, and that would be the halacha. Or the Sanhedrin would say, we don't have a tradition on this, let's debate and take a majority opinion. And then the judges on the Sanhedrin would enter into discussion, conversation, debate around the issue. A vote would be taken, and the majority decision would become the halacha of the time. That eventually eroded the bureaucracy, the system that was so carefully set up to avoid machloket Israel, to avoid argument and dissension within the Jewish people. That very system eroded and imploded. Now, we would think the reason that it imploded was because the Sanhedrin was eventually disbanded. After the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the Sanhedrin continued for a short while, and then it no longer existed. So there was no higher court, this kind of appeal court, this constitutional court at the very top that could make these decisions that would be binding on all of Klal Yisrael. That no longer existed. We would have thought that's what went wrong ultimately, and why subsequently, right until our day, we have so many different opinions about so many different things, and the differences are substantial. Although there are guardrails, all of Orthodox Yiddishkeit, all of Orthodox Judaism, all of qualified scholars and Talmidei Chachamim abide within those guardrails of Torah methodology and Torah thinking. But nevertheless, there is that wide range. You've got the Hasidim, and you've got the Yeshivisha world, and you've got the modern Orthodox world, and everything in between, all absolutely committed to following halakha, following the Shulchan Aruch, but a wide variance of how to go about that and what it actually looks like. And why that happened, the Gemara tells us, is not because the Sanhedrin ceased to exist. That wasn't the problem. What actually caused the ultimate collapse of this elaborate system of judicial interpretation was Misherabu Talmidei Shammai v'Hillel Shelo Shimshu Kol Tzorkan. After the period of Hillel and Shammai, there were a large number of scholars who were enormously knowledgeable, and experienced in halakha, but only one deficiency in this large number of people was lo shimshu kol tzorkan. They didn't serve sufficient apprenticeship with their rabbeim, with their teachers. And as a result of that, says the Gemara, Rabu Machlokes B'Yisrael, there was a growing and multiplicity of machlokes, of different opinions, of dissension, v'na'aseit Torah kishtei Torot. And in fact, these different opinions at that time gathered under the two umbrellas of the worldview of Hillel and the worldview of Shammai, and they became known as Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And these two worldviews developed to the point where there was halachic difference. There were major issues of halachic concern that couldn't be resolved. There was no Sanhedrin that could say, this is the way it's going to be. And so it was as if they were developing almost two sets of Torah within the Jewish community of the times. And I want to explore briefly this idea that it wasn't the absence of the Sanhedrin that caused the machloket. It was the deficiency in the level of shimush, the level of apprenticeship that the Talmudim of Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel engaged in. Now, the Rambam makes it very clear in his Akdama to the Mishnayos, in his introduction to the Mishnayos, referencing this very brisa that we've just learned. He makes it very clear that this was not a criticism of the Talmudim of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. It was just that they didn't have that capacity that the earlier sages had, including Hillel and Shammai themselves. And that as a result of that, they weren't able to resolve some of these machlokas, these dissensions, and we'll discuss in a moment why. But what's important, says the Rambam, they were the greatest authorities of their time, and we're bound by their views. And even if their views clash, and even if their views are opposite, we learn something from all of their views. We have to understand, we know how to make halachic decisions out of these different viewpoints, but we certainly have to study all the viewpoints because all of them are so incredibly valid. What was the problem with apprenticeship? Why did that cause this machloket? Why does this bring about this intensification and magnification of dissension? What does it mean? We need to refer back to Gemara in Sota on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. We learned that during the Daf Yomi, of course, as part of the Matmonim, but I didn't give a shir on this particular piece in the Gemara Sota, where the Gemara says there are two phrases that seem to be somewhat almost contradictory, and the Gemara clarifies them. One is the idea of a chosid shote, a pious person who is stupid. And the Gemara gives the example of that as a person who sees a woman drowning in the sea. She's obviously not properly clothed because she's battling the currents of the ocean or the river. And he's afraid to jump in to save her because he will see a woman inappropriately dressed, and he's worried about tzniut. So he's pious because he's worried about tzniut, but he's stupid. He's an idiot for thinking that is a reason not to save a life. That's an example of a chassid shote. So there are people and there are times when there are clashing values. There's a value of tzniut and there's a value of pikuach nefesh. What do you do when they clash? How do you trade off? That's the important part of learning tradition, to actually know how to trade off values in the Torah, principles in the Torah, halachot in the Torah, midot in the Torah, that appear to be paradoxical, that appear to be contradictory. And the Gemara goes on talking about another such phrase, which is a rasha arum, a wicked person who is deceitful, who is conniving, who is sly. What is a wicked, sly person? What is the wickedness? What is the slyness? And Ulas says an amazing thing. He says, this is somebody, shekara v'shana, as Rashi says, that means he knows the whole of Chumash, he knows the whole of Tanakh. V'shana, he knows the whole of Shas. He's been through Shas, he knows Shas, he has mastery of the information, of the data that makes up the Torah. But lo shimesh talmidei chachamim. He didn't serve apprenticeship with talmidei chachamim. Why is that serving apprenticeship so important? Explains Rashi. What it means is lilmod sfarat hagmara beta'amei hamishnah mahem. Learning the logic, the underlying principles, the method of thinking that underpins the details of complex halakha. Halakha is a majorly complex system of many, many details. But underpinning those details, there are principles and there's a methodology of logic, of reasoning and of thinking. And what Lo Shimesh Talmidei Chachamim means, it's not just about the apprenticeship. It's once a person hasn't had sufficient apprenticeship, he hasn't been exposed sufficiently to the methodology of reasoning and to the underlying principles of halakha. And I've always wondered with this Gemara, why would the Gemara use the phrase then of Lo Shimesh Talmidei Chachamim? Why doesn't the Gemara just say a Rasha Arum? And Rashi explains the Rishut is that he doesn't know the halakha well. The Arum is, the slyness is, that people respect him and honor him as if he is a Talmid Chacham, but he isn't really a Talmid Chacham because he doesn't understand. He has knowledge, but not wisdom. He has information, but not understanding. And a Talmid Chacham is somebody who not only has a knowledge of the details and of the data involved, but also has the inner wisdom and a deep understanding of how the halakha works. This person doesn't have that, but the Gemara uses the strange phrase and says the problem is not that he doesn't have understanding and wisdom. The Gemara uses the phrase he hasn't had apprenticeship. What is the link between apprenticeship and understanding and wisdom? And if one has been fortunate enough to live in the presence of great people, of great Talmidei Chachamim, of great poskim, of great Rosh Yeshivas, one realizes how much one learns from watching them live, not just from learning their teachings. Because when you're teaching something, you're teaching it in its purest form. But when you're living it, you're dealing with the reality of paradox, of conflicting values, conflicting principles. And you're seeing that all the time. The need to weigh up chesed and emes. For example, do I tell a person what I really think of them? Or am I kind and tell them something that's rather sugar-coated? We've talked about that once before. The need sometimes to trade off apparently conflicting principles and values in the Torah. And when you're living with the Talmid Chacham, you see him doing it all the time. You see him weighing up the issue of not wasting time and avoiding Bitul Torah and yet engaging in normal conversation with people. You see him weighing up these different issues all the time and navigating the paradoxes that are inherent in Shmirat Halakha and the keeping of Halakha. And the way that is done is by a deep understanding of the underlying principle. If all I know are the facts of halakha, if all I know is what the Shulchan Aruch says I have to do, I'm faced with the danger of fundamentalism. And we have that danger in our own religion as well. And that means I know the facts, I know the details, I don't understand the principles, and therefore I don't have the ability to navigate. I don't have the ability to apply these halachot in a way that makes sense in the real world in which we're living. And that ability to be able to navigate and balance the details of halakha, never foregoing halakha, never compromising and adulterating halakha, and yet being able to apply it and adapt it to life. That's the work of a posek. That's what a posek does. If the halakha is clear, may I turn the light on Shabbat, you don't need a posek for that. You look up the Shulchan Aruch, and the answer is no. That's easy. But now if there's a sick person who needs the light on, if there's a physician who needs the light on, can I turn the light on or can't I turn the light on? Is caring for the ill person more important, or the observing of the halakha of not turning the light on Shabbat? And so endless such examples. That's where you need a posek, or at least to have somebody who's had shimush talmidei chachamim, somebody who has had enough apprenticeship to learn how to balance these competing issues. And so when the Gemara comes to teach us this whole principle that once there were many people after the time of Hillel and Shammai who knew the halakha as best they possibly could and were the greatest experts of their time, but they didn't have that level of apprenticeship that the earlier generations had. They had to draw conclusions which they had to abide by because that was the halakha as they knew it and they understood it. But they weren't able to resolve differences. They weren't able to understand each other's viewpoints and find common ground, because to do that you need to be working with principles, not with detail. As important as the detail is in halakha, and it will always be crucially important, understanding the underlying principles are equally important, and particularly when it comes to resolving that conflict. And that is why we're told that once this occurred, that we had a generation of Talmidei Chachamim who, through no fault of their own, didn't have sufficient shimush, they didn't have a sufficient apprenticeship, they didn't understand the Svarat HaGemara B'Ta'amei HaMishnah Mahem, the real deep methodology and principles underlying the mitzvot. They were able to know what they knew, but not able to negotiate conflict and dissension and difference to find that common ground. And the lesson to us, apart from the direct lesson of understanding the principle in Torah and in Halakha, is in areas of life altogether when one gets involved in a dispute. And a dispute can be a domestic dispute at home between a husband and a wife. It can be a dispute between a parent and a child or between siblings. It can be a business dispute. It's always important to try and get to the underlying principle, because the argument is very often not about what people say it is, or sometimes even what they think it is. Sometimes there's an underlying principle that is being argued. Two different viewpoints, two different worldviews. But if we can get at the underlying principle, there is an opportunity to find common ground and to find resolution. And that's the art of avoiding machloket. Avoiding machloket is not a question of avoidance. Avoiding machloket, avoiding dissension, is a way of resolving conflict through understanding the principles that can provide the basis for common ground.